Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those on the West Coast and to those in Hawaii. Aloha. Thanks to everybody for joining us on this webinar. This is one of a series of webinars that we're doing for the Smart Management for Small Water Systems project that's funded by the U.S. EPA. I am Shadi Eskaf. I am going to be presenting the content. Francine is moderating, and she will be reviewing your questions throughout the day. So if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them, and she will queue them for me so that I can respond. Francine and I are both with the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and you can see a link to our website there. This is our mission statement, and what we do at the EFC here at UNC is we help local governments and non-governmental organizations figure out how to pay for environmental services. So water and wastewater is a huge portion of our work, and rate setting, rate structure design, capital improvement planning, regionalization, partnerships between water systems, looking at water loss, all these types of issues that water utilities deal with. We are available for water systems. If you have questions, how do you communicate with your boards, how do you communicate with the customers, how do you set your rates? Those are the type of questions that we can help with. We're not a consultancy. We're kind of half and half of between consultancy and within the university. So we do some research to advance the knowledge, but at the same time, our students are you all, the utility managers, the regulators, the finance directors. Those are the people that we work with and not university students specifically. We are one of 10 EFCs across the country. Each region has an EFC. Each EFC has its own kind of specialty and focus. Ours is mostly on drinking water and wastewater and on energy and green government. Other EFCs have other specialties, but you can always contact any one of the EFCs, and we work together as a network. So we always refer people who have got questions to other EFCs if somebody else can answer that question better. The EFC Network got this grant from US EPA, and we are toward the end of completing it for this year. And the project was focused on helping small water systems, specifically those that serve 10,000 people or fewer, in all 50 states and all the 5 territories, in helping achieve their drinking water services needs and goals. And we provide workshops, trainings, and direct assistance on these 7 different topics that you see listed here: asset management, water loss reduction, water system collaboration, fiscal planning and rate setting, which is what this webinar is focused on, energy management, funding coordination, managerial and financial leadership. We've already completed workshops and trainings in almost every single state and every single territory in the United States, but we are available to provide direct assistance. So if you have any questions, then what we recommend you do is you click on this link or go to efcnetwork.org and click on Request Assistance, and you can schedule yourself for a phone call or an email conversation with one of the EFCs on any one of these topics, and there is no charge for that service. EPA is completely funding this service. So thanks to EPA, you're able to ask your questions, and we'll be here to help. So I want to start off by just understanding who's in the room right now. I'm going to ask Francine to launch a first poll. So you have a poll in front of you. If you can please respond. Does your utility charge customers directly for water services? And by directly, we mean you send them a bill. You send a customer a bill for water specifically. And it could either be based on the volume that they use, or it could be that it's just a flat fee. It's 25 bucks a month, but it's specifically for water. If you answer no, then you're telling us that you're including water in rent, essentially. You're not charging customers. You're not sending them a bill. If you're a regulator or if you don't work with a water system, you can say you don't know or not applicable. Or if you've recently helped a water system, if you're a consultant or regulator and you've recently helped a water system, feel free to pretend you are the utility manager for that system throughout the rest of this webinar and answer these questions in their stead. I think we have enough responses, so we'll stop here. Actually, another bump up. Okay, let's stop. Thank you. So it looks like everybody on this call either charges the water customers directly for water, or you don't know it's not applicable, but nobody here includes water with rent. And we've helped a lot of water systems like that, mobile home parks, apartment complexes where water is just part of rent. But it's good to know that everybody here charges rates. So when I'm talking to you today, I'll keep that in mind, that nobody here is talking about water rates and rent. Thank you very much. We can close that. A couple of definitions that will help us throughout this webinar. There's a difference between rates and rate structures, and I want to make that clear as I'm talking. Rates, if I say the word rates, I mean the price per month or the price per unit of consumption. So it's a $4.50 per 1,000 gallons. It's actually that dollar amount. That's what I'm calling the rate. A rate structure is the set of rules that you use to determine which rates apply to a customer. So it's the base charges. It's, do you have an increasing block rate structure? Do you have uniform rates? It's whether or not you have different customer classes. So I'm going to be focusing this presentation specifically on rate structures. I'm not going to be talking very much about how do you price rates, how do you calculate what the rates are supposed to be. The focus is going to be specifically on the rate structures themselves and how do you design those to achieve whatever objectives you've got for your utility. This is a mantra that I'd like to have made clear, and everybody has that in mind as I talk for the rest of this webinar. There is no one specific rate structure that will work for every utility. There is no perfect rate structure out there. If you logged in hoping that I'm going to tell you what you need to have your rate structure to be today, I can't do that. I need to know a lot more information about your customer base and your cost structures and your revenue requirements. So there is no one rate structure that fits all needs. And that even includes utilities that have very similar types of costs. Even with if your costs are similar, you might find that your customer base is completely different than another utility's customer base. And the way that you charge rates, the rate structures, the set of rules that you use should really be tailored to your utility and not copied from somebody else's. The objectives for the webinar are threefold. The first is to present the basics of different rate structure designs, the different components that go into them, and I'm going to be talking some of the just in basic terminology. So it's not going to be very complicated things. If you already know all these rate structure designs, then at least listen for suggestions for other ideas that you might not have considered before as well. But we'll be talking about the basics first, and then we'll go and dig a little bit deeper and talk about different kinds of rate structures that might fit different types of needs better. So we'll discuss when it's appropriate to favor some elements of rate structures over others based on specific scenarios that we'll be presenting on later on today. And the last thing is I'll introduce some tools and resources that might help you with rate setting, and not specifically or only on rate structure design, but also on calculating the rates that you can use to ensure revenue stability. Much of the presentation that you will see here comes from some resources that we gathered from external sources, as well as some things that we've developed here internally at the EFC. There are some really great handbooks and guidebooks out there available for water utilities on rate setting and rate structure design. AWWA has at least 2 really good manuals that are available, the M1 manual and the M54 manual. The M1 manual is kind of seen as the Bible of rate structure design in this industry in the United States. It's got all the details, and it specifies how you can actually calculate the prices and what elements are appropriate in different circumstances. Developing rates for small systems is the M54 manual. It's a shorter manual and specifically targets small water systems. So it would apply to almost everybody here on the call. Both of those are available on the AWWA website. I don't work for AWWA, so I'm not promoting this. I'm not getting any royalties out of this, but I'm just promoting that they've got these resources available on their website. I think they're relatively low cost. They're not free. I think the M54 manual might be $50 for AWWA members. If you're looking for free resources, EPA has a great guide that you can download straight off of their website, and it's called Setting Small Drinking Water System Rates for a Sustainable Future. And in it, it does similar things that to the M1 and M54 manual. It explains how you could look at your water systems costs and allocate the cost to different customers, calculate what your revenue requirements are, calculate what your revenues would be under different rate structures, and then calculate what you need for reserves. And after all that, it will let you. It will show you how you can calculate what the prices and what the rates should be given a specific rate structure. So that's an excellent guide that's available, and we always talk about this one when we present at the trainings and workshops. Another one that's available also free of charge is a guidebook that we had developed here at the EFC at UNC. This was developed 3 or 4 years ago. I think it was 2009, specifically for North Carolina water systems, because North Carolina Department of Environment and Natural Resources paid for it. But the resource guide is actually really helpful for all utilities, and it's not too specific to North Carolina. There are some things in there that are North Carolina specific, but we mentioned that in the guidebook. The guidebook is free, available for download, and actually much of the presentation that you'll see today comes directly from that guidebook. The guidebook is written as a step-by-step guide with PowerPoint slides and notes beneath each slide explaining each step, and that's essentially what I'll be doing here today. So what goes into reviewing rates for the next year? Most utilities that we've talked to at least try to review the rates every year. Whether or not they raise rates every year is a completely different matter. But when you sit down at the table each year, or maybe it's every 2 years, and you're looking at your rates, what are some of the things that come to mind? And I'll just show some examples here, and if you have some other great ideas that you wanted to let us know about, feel free to put it in the questions box, and we'll track that and we'll use them for future presentations. But the first thing that really comes to mind when you're reviewing rates is, will our rates be enough to cover our costs? Or will our revenues be enough to cover our costs? So is it going to be providing enough cost recovery in the future? I apologize for the pop-ups. I'll keep clicking them off. But what is cost recovery? What exactly goes into cost recovery? You've got capital costs. You've got depreciation. You've got current O&M costs. The O&M costs might be changing over time. If you have a future capital project, there are a lot of things that go into costs that you need to account for when you're setting your rates. Everybody here probably knows all this. There are other considerations that come into play when you're looking at your rates each year. Does the rate structure follow applicable laws? And laws do change over time. Whether because of a drought or whether because a change of administration, there are some states that have very specific regulatory laws even for local government water systems. And of course, if you're a investor-owned water system that charges customers directly, then you're regulated by a Utilities Commission. Well, there's specific laws and regulations that are applicable to rate structure designs that you need to know of. For example, is it even legal for you to have a rate structure that's unique for customers who are outside the city boundaries? Can you do that? And in some states, there are actually confusing laws or contradictory laws on that. Are we allocating the cost to the right customers? So if you've got a mix of residential customers and commercial customers or industrial customers even, these types of customers have completely different needs for water. Some of them require residential customers require a small amount of water, especially when they're not irrigating, and then maybe they will peak during the summertime if they're irrigating outdoors. Commercial customers, industrial customers might need a lot of water, but it's a consistent amount every single month. And the fact that there's peaking going on for residential and sometimes there's no peaking for commercial means that each of these types of customers require different types of or incur different costs to the utility to provide that water. And you have to separate out what the costs are for each customer class when you're doing a cost of service study. When you're setting rates, the question that comes up is, will our customers understand these rates? You can have a very complicated rate structure and that will do everything that you want it to do. But if customers don't understand it and they push back during public notice periods, you might have to readjust your rate structure, the rate structure design. Will the customers be able to pay these rates? That's a very common question, especially when you're presenting to the board or to a council. They'll ask about the affordability of the rates. Do the rates send the right signals to our customers, right price signals to our customers based on our objectives? If you're a utility that is operating at nearly 80 or 90% capacity, and you need to be encouraging conservation, but you have a decreasing block rate structure that provides a lower unit price for higher consumption amounts, you're sending contradictory message. You're saying that it's cheaper to buy more water, even though you're really supposed to be encouraging conservation. So there are different types of rate structures that would meet specific types of objectives. And by and large, this is what I'll be focusing on this presentation today. There are other very important questions to ask, which one of them is, will the revenues be resilient to changing water demands? And I wanted to mention this as a reminder for those who have seen the previous webinars or this is your first time. We've seen a lot of evidence that water demand, especially residential water demand, is decreasing over time. So if you're not making that assumption, if you don't realize that water use is decreasing over time, and if that is happening for your utility, then you might be finding that your revenues coming in each year, you're finding a revenue shortfall each year, and that revenue shortfall might be growing. So you might want to analyze what your water use demand trends have been in the past few years, especially on the residential side. Of course, it's not true that every utility would see a decreasing in demand, but we're seeing that more utilities than not have a decreasing demand for residential customers. So these are types of questions that get asked around the table when you're reviewing rates. This one in particular is what I'll be focusing on. And the process of setting rates in each of the different guides that I've mentioned before has some process that is similar to this one. It essentially involves you learning some background information and knowing enough about rates and rate structures to be able to structure your rates, and that goes on continuously. There's no set period for that. So by attending this webinar, you're helping fulfill this requirement. So that's one step. The next step is to understand who you are serving and the specific characteristics of your utility and your community. Different utilities have different cost structures, and if you serve different types of communities, the way that you charge them really should be tailored to who you are serving. And I'll show some examples of that later on. So the next step was to determine what the critical characteristics are, followed by designing the most appropriate rate structure. Again, the rate structure, not the rates. And we find that a lot of utilities skip this step entirely. They just assume that they've got a rate structure by design. They've got a base charge and they've got a uniform rate or an increasing block rate structure, and they'll just stick with that. And all they do during an annual review is make sure that the prices or the rates that are set for each of the blocks is correct for the next year. So there's a lot of jumping over this step, but I'm arguing this is a very important step because the way that you structure your rates sends different price signals and can either help your utility meet or not meet specific objectives. So that's why we'll be focusing specifically on this step. After you've decided on what the most appropriate rate structure is, then you can compute what the rates should be when you project your costs and your revenues and try to price out what the rates should be given the rate structure that you've already decided on. It's not essential to review the rate structure every single year. I think that you should definitely be reviewing your rates every year, whether or not you need to raise rates. But you should be at least looking at the rate structure itself every few years, maybe every 3 to 5 years, just to make sure that the rate structure design meets your objectives and to assess whether or not your objectives have changed as a utility. After you've computed your rates, the next step is to reevaluate and just make sure that your rate structure and your rates meet all the objectives that you've set for your rate structure in the future. And if you have to, you can cycle back and adjust your rate structure design and recompute what the rates are to make sure that everything fits correctly. At that point, you then present to the board with a proposed new rate structure design and rates. So with that, we're going to open up another poll. And the question is, when was the last time that your utility seriously considered changing the rate structure design? Not the rates, but the rate structure itself. And by seriously consider doesn't mean that you've changed the rate structure. It just means that you've looked at it with a critical eye to determine whether or not you need to change the blocks, or you need to change from a uniform to an increasing block, or you want to have more on the base charge and less on the volumetric rate. So when's the last time that you've reviewed the rate structure design itself? And if this one doesn't really apply to you, then you don't have to answer this question. So if you're a regulator or a state, either think of a utility that you've helped recently, or just ignore the question. And that will apply in future polls as well. If it doesn't apply to you, you don't need to answer this question. I will give you another 10 seconds or 5 seconds. Okay, thank you. So it's almost evenly spread across the board. I'm pleasantly surprised that 26% said that in the past couple of years you've looked at the rate structure and you've analyzed whether or not you need to change that. So that's a very positive sign. It's actually a higher percentage than most of the time when I present this this training. I find that fewer utilities do that within 2 years. Usually we see every 3 to 5 years. If you haven't changed rates in the past 5 or considered your rate structure in the past 5 years, so 6 to 10 years or more than 10 years, or if this was before your time and it's always been this rate structure and you're just working off of that, I seriously recommend reviewing the rate structure design, because things have changed in the past 5 years, and not just the economy, but also the weather patterns and the fact that residential customers are using less water. There may be some droughts in some locations in the United States, the water shortage periods that have affected your water supply. So different things have happened in the past 5 years. It might be worth looking at the rate structure design itself and seeing if that needs to change before you propose new rates in the future. All right, thank you. We got a comment also from one of the attendees saying that the cost of chemicals have changed too. That's absolutely true. It's not just the, and it's a great segue, thank you very much. It's not just the fact that that water shortage has happened and there's economy effects. Cost of chemicals are going up. Cost of power is going up. If you're purchasing water from another utility, I'm sure those rates have been going up over time as well. So knowing what, that is actually the first thing that you need to do, is to figure out what your operating expenses are going to be next year. And if these things are going up, you should be projecting that when you're setting your budget. So I'm touching a little bit here on rates and rate setting, but I won't get into too much detail. That's what those other resources and guidebooks are there for. But you need to know what your costs are, what are your O&M expenses, and how fast are they going up from one year to the next. Is your customer base changing next year? Do you expect a new commercial or industrial customer to come on board? Do you think that your customer base is decreasing? Are people just leaving your town or leaving your community? Is your water demand changing? Do you have any debt service payment requirements? And also, do you have any large capital expenses in the next few years? This one I think is very important. If you do not already have a capital improvement plan, there are lots of resources and guides available that would help you create one. And I think that it is an important thing. And if you already have one, then when you set rates, obviously you should be looking at your CIP, making sure that your rates will cover capital expenses that you expect to have in the next year. An asset management plan is critical for all systems, including small water systems. And I believe we have some webinars and workshops specifically on asset management. If you have questions on that, feel free to contact us, and we can help you create CIPs and asset management plans to some degree at least. So these are different kinds of costs that you should be aware of. And then the last thing is I'd like to ask every utility to at least try to calculate this, which is how much of your projected expenses and costs in the next year will be fixed versus variable. I'll define that in the next slide. Fixed costs are, or sorry, let's start with variable. Variable costs are costs that depend entirely on the actual volume of water that you either purchase or you treat or you pump out to the customers. So the more water that's flowing through your water system, the higher those costs will be. And those costs are essentially the water purchase, if you're a purchase system, chemicals, and energy. I don't really know of any other cost category that would be considered variable in the short term. Almost everything else fits under a fixed cost. And fixed costs are those that really don't matter how much water that flows through your water system. Staffing, especially in the short term. So staffing, you're not going to hire and fire operators based on the volume of water that you sell in the next year. Maybe in the long term that might change, but staffing in general doesn't change that quickly based on water demand. Lab costs, meter reading, billing, debt service, capital costs, everything from vehicle, administrative costs, all these costs are essentially fixed costs. So if you try to calculate, if you have your budget, try to separate out what your costs are into variable versus fixed, and determine the percentage of your total costs that are variable. I think that is an important thing, and that will guide the design of the rate structure that's appropriate for your utility. And I'll show some scenarios and examples later on as to why this is so important to know the difference between your fixed costs and variable costs. I don't think a lot of small systems have done that. I think even a lot of the large systems haven't done that categorization, but we're seeing a lot more of that happening. A lot more of the consultants and the cost of service studies are requiring that kind of assessment, and I think it's an important thing to do. We got a question asking whether or not repairs to lines and to wells will be considered variable costs. No, I would put that under capital costs. I mean, the fact that you're selling 2,000 gallons this month versus 3,000 gallons next month doesn't really affect the fact that you have to replace your well. If the well is broken, you have to fix it, and that's a fixed cost. I mentioned in the process of setting rates that you have to understand your community and your utility characteristics. So these are some of the questions that you should be asking yourselves before you even sit down to review your rates. Do you expect to meet demands comfortably? And that's a question of, do you have a water shortage period, or are you running near capacity? Do you need to be encouraging conservation, for example? Or on the other hand, if you have excess capacity, you've lost some of your largest customers, now you have excess capacity, do you need to change your rate structure design? And I think the answer to that is yes. If you lose a lot of your larger customers and you have fewer smaller customers who are picking up the tab, you're going to have to shift your costs towards more of the fixed revenue costs. What's the makeup of your served community? Do you serve a lot of or many large families? Or are they mostly just average size homes or small homes? What is the community's ability to pay? Is it a seasonal community? Do you have, are you serving a resort town or a community with a lot of second homes, where in the summertime or in the wintertime you see an influx of customers coming in and then they all leave during the off season? Do you have a large fraction of your revenues coming from a small number of customers? So I didn't ask how many of you serve fewer than 500 customers, but we've seen a lot of utilities that have fewer than 500 accounts, and they have large fixed costs that they have to pay for. And spreading those fixed costs over 500 customers or less is a very big burden, but it also really affects how the rate structure design should be. What's the mix between your residential and non-residential customers, and who are your biggest customers? Are you serving specifically residential communities only? Or are you serving some industrial and commercial customers? And if that largest customer leaves, does that mean that you're selling 50% less water next year, and then you'll have to readjust your rate structure design? In the past few years, how much of your revenues have been fixed versus variable? So the same thing I ask that you try to do with your costs, separating out your costs into fixed and variable categories. You can do the same thing with revenues. And this one's a little bit easier because, at least in the short term, variable revenues are those that are 100% dependent on the volume of water. So those are the volumetric rates. Those are the revenues that you get when you're charging something like $2 per 1,000 gallons or $3 per 100 cubic feet. It's that price multiplied by that volume. That's the revenue that we're calling variable revenues. Everything else that you're getting into the utility on the revenue side, more or less, are all fixed revenues. They don't depend on the volume of water. So that includes even the minimum charges or the base charges that you charge per month. And by base charge, I'm talking about how much you charge a customer for zero use. If they're active accounts, but they don't use any water, it's that first charge. It's like the $20 per month base charge that you apply in addition to the volumetric charge at the top. Base charges are fixed, flat fees, penalties, and charges, connection fees, impact system development charges, all those fees and revenues are coming in. These are all fixed revenues and not variable. If you look at them side by side, and this is just one example of a utility. I don't say that this is applicable to everybody here, especially for small systems. But if you try to break down your revenues and your costs by fixed versus variable, you'll see an interesting pattern. And this is an actual example from, this is a large utility, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Utilities, but a lot of the smaller systems also see a similar pattern. You might find that a vast majority of your revenues come from your volumetric rates. So those are the variable revenues, and a very small portion of your revenues are fixed. Fixed revenues are those revenues that you can count on month after month. Those are not going to change based on how much water you're going to be selling. So if demand fluctuates because of weather, because of price, because of season, because customers are coming in or not, the revenue that you're getting, the fixed revenue, is the only thing that you can really bank on from month to month, and that creates your revenue stability. The variable revenues are those that change quite a bit. On the expenses side, though, you'll find that usually it's the reverse. The vast majority of your expenses will probably be fixed costs, unless you're a purchased water system. If that's the case, you might find that most of your costs are variable because of the price of the water that you're paying for to purchase the water from another system. So expenses, but in most cases, expenses are mostly fixed. So what happens when customers reduce demand? And again, because of whatever reason, whether it's weather or price, customers reduce demand. If your revenues and your expenses look like this, then you'll find that your revenues will decrease substantially because of your variable revenues decreasing, but your expenses won't change very much because a portion of your variable expenses is very little. So if customers reduce demand and you look like this, you might have a revenue shortfall. You won't be getting enough revenue coming in to pay for all of your fixed costs. So an important balancing act that you'll find here in the rate structure design is how much weight do you put into your base charges and into your fixed revenues versus how much you want to put into your variable rates. The more that you put in your fixed charges and the base charges, the more revenue stability you will have. The more that you put into your variable rates and your variable charges, the more that you can encourage conservation, the more that you could try to match the fluctuating price if you're a purchased water system. But those are the it's a different kind of a utility and different kind of revenue and cost requirement if you have a purchase system versus non-purchase. An important step to begin to do before you design your rate structure or decide what the appropriate rate structure design is for your utility is to list out all of the objectives that you as a utility have and what you're trying to encourage your customers to do. To list them out and then to rank them. And the ranking part is really critical. In this slide, we're just showing 4 different kinds of objectives. There are many, many more. And this is not a comprehensive list, but the objectives that we see a lot of utilities have with the rate structures and rate structure designs: full cost recovery and revenue stability. They want to make sure that the rate structure provides enough revenues to pay for especially their fixed costs. Encouraging conservation is a growing field, and it's an important field for a lot of systems. An objective, I mean. There are some utilities that are trying to foster business-friendly practices. In other words, encourage economic development by setting different kinds of rate structures to encourage new industry and new commercial customers to come to town based on the rate structure. So that is a different kind of objective. it doesn't really apply if you are a small residential-only utility, but if you are a medium-sized water system, this might be a very important objective for you, especially if you've lost your largest customer already. Maintaining affordability is a really critical objective that we see a lot of utilities talk about. And the question I'd like to pose, keeping rates low, but for whom? And who's going to, if you're going to keep rates low for some customers, who's going to be paying the rest of the revenues that you need to pay for all of your costs? So these are 4 different objectives. And if you think about it, if you try to achieve all 4 things at once, which is what a lot of utilities might want to do, you might find that there are some problems there and some contradictions, and there will be some trade-offs between some of these objectives. For example, if you're encouraging, or if you're looking for full cost recovery, but at the same time you want to maintain affordability, there's a little bit of a trade-off going on here, because if maintaining affordability is the most important thing, you might have to sacrifice some of your full cost recovery in order to meet that objective. I do not recommend this approach at all, but it is something that as far as explaining how these trade-offs work, if you're weighing one much more heavily than other, you might be sacrificing one objective in order to achieve another one. If you switch it around and look at the encouraging conservation and economic development, if you want to foster business-friendly practices and encourage new industry to come into town, then you might be interested in setting lower rates at higher consumption amounts. But by doing that, you won't be really helping your encouraging conservation objective. There are some ways to structure rate structures in order to achieve several of these objectives at the same time, but it requires a bit of a balancing act, and setting rates and rate structures is not really purely a science. You'll find that it's a lot of art and a lot of negotiations as well. So this is why it's critical to actually rank, to sit down and to say what your objectives are, but to rank them. Number 1 objective, number 2, number 3, number 4. It's a very difficult thing to do, but having this rank is really important later on when you're setting the rate structure and you are facing a trade-off between, do we raise our base charges or not? By going back to the rankings of your objectives, that might help inform some of those trade-off decisions that you would have to make as you design your rate structure. So let's do that now, and Francina will launch the first poll, asking which one of these 5 is the most important objective for your utility. And like I said, these are 4 out of many, many different kinds of objectives. You might have a completely different objective that is your number 1. Feel free to put other. But what is, if you had to pick one, what is the most important one of that list? All right, I think we can stop here. Thank you. Let's take a look at see what happens. 76% in the room said recover costs. 16% said maintaining affordability, and then you've got economic and encouraging conservation kind of lagging behind there. That's almost always the case. Every single time I've presented this, I've always seen almost identical kind of breakdown too. The vast majority say recovering costs is the most important objective. There is a substantial minority that say affordability is more important than recovering costs. And that is an objective, so I don't want to add any value or judgment value to it. Water conservation and economic development usually lag behind, but I see that in most cases it's true that utilities tend to look to recovering costs first before the other kinds of objectives. Thank you. And now we'll actually launch the poll one more time, and we'll ask you what your second most important objective is. So if you already answered recover costs, don't put that one again, unless you really think it's just recover costs, recover costs, recover costs, and that's the only objective you've got. But if you have to pick a second one, what is your second most important one? Okay, thank you. Maintaining affordability comes second for most utilities, followed by conservation and economic development as well. So it looks like in the audience we have probably more of the smaller utilities that are not serving a lot of, or not too concerned about economic developments right now. It's mostly recovering costs, maintaining affordability, and then encouraging conservation where necessary. So thank you all for these answers. If you think of some really interesting objectives as well that doesn't fit one of these four, feel free to put them into the question box, and we'll make a note of that as well.
So we have a question or a comment, and it says, recover cost is mandated by the PUC, so almost no choice in the poll. They require this.
Thank you for the comments, Sandra, and that's absolutely true. If you're an investor-owned utility that's regulated by the Public Utilities Commission, of course, recovering costs is going to be mandated, and you have to achieve that. So that will probably force recover costs to be your #1 objective. Another one will be just to make sure that you're in line with all of the PUC requirements as well, so beyond the recover costs. Another really important factor in this is the funding agencies. If you've received any loans recently and had to pay for, if you're paying for debt service, a lot of these funding agencies require cost recovery with an excess in your budget as well. So you'd have to have reserves, and you'd have to have enough revenues to be able to pay for your debt service and O&M expenses, plus an additional 20 or 25% on top of that. So they will force you to have recovering costs as your #1 objective as well. So we'll start getting into the details of the rate structure design. I'm going to be talking about these 8 different topics, maybe not so much for #7, but the rate structure designs, these are different types of elements that you have to deal with. And the first thing is to decide whether or not you have different customer classes and distinction, what the billing period will be, what the base charge is, whether or not to include, an allowance with the base charge, what the volumetric rate structure will be, so what kind of, is it uniform rates or increasing block? If you have block rates, then you have to figure out what to do with the blocks, the number of blocks, the block sizes, and how steep the differentials will be in the rates between blocks as well. Temporal adjustments is just a different way of saying your rates can change based on your water supply. So if you have a drought or if you have a water shortage response plan and you want to encourage conservation with your rates, as well as to ensure that you're promoting conservation and you're ensuring that you have enough revenue coming in, even though customers are reducing demand, that's what we're calling temporal adjustments. Sometimes people call those drought surcharges. We're calling them here temporal adjustments to kind of go beyond just drought specifically. Frequency of rate changes is not really an element of rate structure design, but it's so important that we put it in here as a separate line, because looking at how frequently to change your rates is definitely an important thing to consider as you're designing your rate structure itself. So go through each of these individually, and the first thing is customer classes and distinction. And there are so many different ways of charging rates, and we've seen literally hundreds of rate sheets from across the country, and we know that there are so many different ways of charging customers, and these are just some of the more common ones. There are other more complicated and more tailored kinds of rate structures out there, but essentially, and what the M1 manual and what the EPA guidebook talk about are these types of customer classes. The first option is to just have one rate structure for all customers. And that's just, it's the easiest one to administer. You don't have to worry about your billing software, identifying different kinds of customers and separating your customer classes. It's one rate structure for all. You can argue that it might be it's either fair, and it really works very well, especially if your customer base is pretty much homogeneous. If you're only serving residential customers, then it's easy to have one rate structure for all customers, and not have to worry about different customer classes. But in reality, most utilities serve different types of customers, and it's easier to charge or to target different customer classes if you have a different rate structure for each type of customer class. In some states, that might not be possible. That might be, or some of these kind of categorizations might not be legal in your state. But I'm trying to show some examples that we might apply to everybody across the nation. So for example, you could have a rate structure for residential customers and then one for non-residential customers. And you would charge completely different rates. You could even have a completely different rate structure design. So for residential customers, you might charge increasing block rates. But for your non-residential customers, you might charge decreasing block rates in order to encourage development of, or encourage economic development. There are some utilities that separate out the non-residential customer class into many other classes. So you can have residential rate structure, an irrigation rate structure, commercial, industrial, governmental, wholesale. We've seen some utilities that have up to 30 different customer classes, and they have a completely different rate structure for each one of these individually. The more you break up your customer class, the more complicated it becomes for your billing software, and the more important it is for you to make sure that you're classifying customers correctly to make sure that you're getting revenues, you're charging the right revenues rates to each customer. Breaking up customer class helps a lot with the cost of service study. When you do cost of service study, you'll be calculating what the revenue requirements are based on the different types of customers. And usually you break down your customer class into these categories anyway, and you'll find that it's more equitable to charge different customer classes a different rate structure. Not necessary, but it's an easy way to be able to target those groups and make sure that you're charging them fair rates. Another example would be to have one rate structure that applies to all of your customer classes, but to design your rate structure in such a way that you're really targeting different kinds of customers. So for example, you might have one increasing block, or not increase, you might have a decreasing block rate structure where the first block is 50,000 gallons a month, which if you know water use demands, for residential customers, most residential customers use about 5,000, 6,000 gallons a month on average. It's rare that they go over 20,000, which is high irrigation season. So if you have a rate structure that sets the first block at 50,000 gallons and then you lower the price beyond that, then essentially what you've done is created a uniform rate structure for your residential customers and a decreasing block rate structure for your non-residential. So the same thing as this previous step, but instead of having a different rate structure design and a different customer class, you just have one rate structure and you're letting the water use patterns dictate who falls into which rate block. There are other examples as well, and you can break up your customer classes based on geographic region, if that's legal in your state. So you can charge different rates for customers outside the municipal limits versus those that are inside city limits. You can sometimes have negotiated rate structures for individual customers. So for example, if you have one really large industry that's in town that uses 50% of your water, you could negotiate a unique rate structure specifically for that one customer. Again, make sure that this is legal in your state. If you have any questions on customer classes and distinctions, please feel free to put them in the question box. I'm going to move on now to the looking at billing periods. Billing periods is just how frequently do you charge your customers, and you can go monthly, bi-monthly, quarterly, annually. The more frequent you charge your customers, the higher those costs will be because you have to read the meters more frequently and you have to bill them more frequently. But at the same time, that will provide you with more revenue stability, and for cash flow it helps the utility because you'll be getting the revenues in every month. The rate changes will be affected more quickly. So if you change rates and you're only charging you're charging quarterly, those rate changes won't happen until maybe 2 or 3 months later on for some customers. If you lose revenues from unpaid bills, customers leave and don't pay their last bill. You have deposits to pay for that, but if you don't have the deposit saved, the lost revenues from unpaid bills are usually smaller, so it's a cost savings for you there. Plus, you're also communicating with the customer much more frequently. If you're sending them monthly bills, that's a monthly price signal to the customer, which we've seen has actually, a lot of research has shown that monthly billing reduces residential customer demands because customers are getting that price signal and they want to reduce their monthly bills, and the more frequently they get a bill, the more opportunity they have to try to reduce the consumption, the more it's on their minds. On the customer side, more frequent billing means smaller, more regular bills, which are easier to pay. There are some communities that charge quarterly, and they really have high rates. So for 2 months out of the, for 2 months, the customers don't have anything to pay, and then that third month when they get a bill, it's a really large bill, and they can't pay it, and that's when you have affordability problems. So for affordability issues, usually it's better to have monthly bills than to have bi-monthly or quarterly, so that it's easier for customers to pay. And they'll be more sensitive to the rate structure design, and there'll be less confusion as far as when you change the rates, they won't see a significant increase after 2 months or 3 months. The other really important thing with monthly billing is that the customer as well as the utility will be much more attuned to water losses as well. So if there are leaks in the customer's house, then you'll notice them if you have monthly bills, but you won't really notice them in the quarterly bills until 3 months later, which means that that leak might be going on for 3 months. And if you have a water shortage issue at your utility, to encourage conservation and efficiency, having monthly consumption helps the customer and the utility monitor water use and make sure that you're not letting leaks slide for a couple of months. The only real advantage for customers to have anything other than monthly billing, so quarterly or larger, is just that there's fewer bills to pay, so it's less hassle for them to do that. There isn't very much research that shows whether or not customers are more or less likely to forget to pay their bills more or less when they get quarterly bills or longer. So it really comes down to affordability and monitoring water use. So essentially, we usually suggest try to go with monthly billing period if you can afford it. If you can show that having bi-monthly or more provides a bigger cost savings than you might be getting through revenue stability and reduced leaks, then bi-monthly sometimes is what larger utilities typically do. Smaller utilities usually go for monthly. The next element to look at is the base charges. And I mentioned the differences between fixed and variable costs and revenues, and this is where the base charge is really critical, because that is, of all the rate structure design elements, that is the one element that really affects the fixed versus variable proportions of your revenues that you can get from customer sales. It's very tempting to have a low base charge because you might be worried about affordability. So the base charge is what every single customer is paying, whether or not they use any water. Having a low base charge means that customers will start off with a low bill and it's relatively more affordable. But if you remember the graph that showed the fixed costs versus variable costs, if you do find that your utility has significantly more fixed costs, you will want to have a lot more revenues coming from your fixed revenues. So that will encourage you to have a higher base charge. And the higher you have a base charge, the more revenue stability you will have as a utility. But at the same time, you're now facing the affordability issue. So there's a trade-off here between cost recovery and revenue stability and cash flow stability versus affordability. Okay. Oh, and I should mention, let me go back to that previous slide. We usually recommend that smaller utilities lean towards higher base charges, simply because the fact that you have a large fixed cost proportion and you have very, very few customers to spread those fixed costs on. So if you're a utility that serves 500 customers and your costs are $200,000, if you split that up into 500 customers, you'll see that your fixed revenue needs are pretty substantial. you don't have a luxury of serving 200,000 customers and spreading out $1 million of costs on 200,000 customers. So the smaller the utility, usually you would want to aim for having a higher base charge. On the other hand, smaller utilities sometimes serve in communities and in areas where customers have lower incomes. So you might need to have a higher base charge to ensure cost recovery on your side, but because of your income levels of your community, it might be very difficult. For you to raise your base charges even higher in order to maintain affordability. So there's a little bit of a balancing act that you have to handle there. There are two common ways of charging base charges. There are other ways, but these are the two most common, and this is what the M1 manual talks about. You can have a constant charge, $35 a month, and you can have a different constant charge by customer class. So if you have a residential customer class and a non-residential rate structure, you can charge $35 a month for residential, and you can charge $100 a month for non-residential customers. So that's one way of doing it. The other way is by meter size. So if you have one rate structure for all of your customers, you can charge a $35 for 5/8 inch or 3/4 inch meter, which, as you know, is for specifically or more or less for residential customers. And then the larger meter sizes, you would charge them a higher base charge. The M1 manual has a table that that equates each of the different meter sizes to the 5/8 inch meter equivalency. So, for example, it says a 1-inch meter is essentially or is equivalent to 1.4 times a 5/8 inch meter. That kind of ratio in the M1 manual table can help you identify or help you figure out how much you want to charge a 1-inch meter compared to what you're charging a 5/8 inch meter as well. And that table is, unfortunately, I don't have that table in a PowerPoint slide, but I'll make sure I'll add that before we post this presentation online. Some utilities include an allowance with the base charge, and some utilities don't. An allowance basically means your base charge is $50 a month, but for the first 2,000 gallons is already included. So any customer who uses between 0 and 2,000 gallons in 1 month is just paying that $50 and nothing else. And then the volumetric rates only affect use beyond that allowance. Utilities that don't include any allowance will find that their bills are much more, or their charges are much more sensitive to water use. So if you're encouraging conservation, if you're encouraging water use efficiency, you would probably prefer to have no allowance included in your base charge. If you do include an allowance, that's usually really do that when you have a high base charge and you're trying to provide a little bit of a break to the customers because of the affordability issue. So you don't want to start off with a really, really high base charge and a high volumetric rate, and customers who are using 1,000 and 2,000 gallons will have a really large bill to pay for. So sometimes utilities will include an allowance with the base charge in order to give the customer a little bit of affordability break. Utilities with low base charges typically should go for no allowance. Utilities with higher base charge may or may not choose to include. They don't have to. And the lower the allowance that you include with the base charge, the better in terms of revenue stability as well, because those are extra costs for the utility that you're not recovering any additional revenues for. So I'm going to ask a quick poll question here. What is your type of base charge, and do you even have a base charge? So we know that some utilities don't include a base charge at all, and that means the customer that uses 0 gallons would be charged $0 for that month. So if that's the case, choose no. But if you include the base, if you have a base charge, please let us know if you have an allowance or not. Okay, thank you. So it's almost an even split between those that have an allowance and those that don't. Only 1 or 2 of you, I think, said that you do not include, you don't have a base charge at all. If you don't have a base charge at all, keep in mind that you have a lot of fixed costs that don't go away. I mean, even the administrative costs, paying for labs, meter reading, those costs don't go away. And if you're not charging something in your base charge, then you're essentially having 100% of your revenues come from your variable charges, and that won't be enough to cover. If customers reduce demand, that will affect revenue stability and cost recovery for your utility. Okay. Different kinds of volumetric rate structures. So beyond the base charge, now you're starting to charge them based on the actual volume of water. There are different types of rate structures, of volumetric rate structures. Uniform rates, sometimes are called flat rates, is where you're charging, let's say, $3 per 1,000 gallons for all kinds of consumption. So a customer who uses 1,000 gallons will get a charge of $3, and then a customer who uses 2,000 gallons will get another charge of, it will be a $6 charge and so forth. And that rate never changes based on the consumption amount. So the more you use, it's still the same rate, but you multiply that rate by the volume, and your bill goes up over time. That's the most common and the simplest and probably the most fair of all. It's just the easiest one to administer as far as volumetric rate structures. There are seasonal rate structures as well. And here we're showing a seasonal uniform rates, but you can really have seasonal rates for any kind of rate structure, including block rates as well. And with seasonal rates, it just means that if we're talking about seasonal uniform rates, you're charging that $2 per 1,000 gallons for all consumption, and that doesn't change. But that's only during the low season. During the high season, and usually that's the summertime, but sometimes it could be winter if you're a mountain resort. If you have a high season rate, then you would charge $4 a month, $4 per 1,000 gallons during the high season, and then lower it back down to the low season rates. So every year you would switch between your high season, low season rates based on the month that you're in. This is good for conservation, and especially for communities that have a seasonal customer base. So if you are a community that you see an influx of customers that come in during the high season, charging them a seasonal rate structure means that you're allocating more of the costs that you're facing because of the seasonal fluctuation of customers onto those customers, and they're paying more of their fair share. And then when they leave, then what you're left behind is with your permanent customer base, and then you're charging them the lower rates to help pay for the rest of the costs that you're incurring. Block rate structures can be decreasing or increasing blocks. Historically, we've started off with decreasing block rate structures where you would charge a price per 1,000 gallons up to a specific consumption amount. So let's say $4 per 1,000 gallons up to 20,000 gallons a month. Beyond that, the rate decreases. So now you're charging $2 per 1,000 gallons for anything above 20,000 gallons. A customer who uses 30,000 would pay that $4 per 1,000 for the first 20, and then will pay the $2 per 1,000 for the last 10,000 gallons. Decreasing block rate structures are, like I said, they're historic, and that's how it used to be done because of cost allocations, and the more volume of water you produce, the lower your per unit costs are. But these are not really good rate structures for residential customers. So if you have a one rate structure for all customers, or if you have a residential rate class, highly recommend not using decreasing block rates, because all that does is it encourages customers to use more water. You're providing a price signal at the higher end to use more water. Decreasing block rates could be useful if you have a mix of residential and commercial customers, or residential and industrial customers especially, in order to give a price break and to make sure that you're providing an equitable charge to the larger users, the non-residential users, because if you have a large water-using customer and you're charging a uniform rate or an increasing block rate, for their total demand, they'll be paying really, really high rates, and they might not, it might not be affordable to them as well. Increasing block rates are the inverse of decreasing block, and we're seeing that a lot of utilities are switching to increasing block rates, especially on the residential side. And it's the unit price increases over a specific consumption amount. So the more you use, the higher the per unit price is as a customer. Really good for residential customers in order to encourage them to use up to the average, or not beyond a specific threshold of consumption. Otherwise, they might be wasting, or they might have some water leaks, or have high irrigation water use that's discretionary, non-essential, and you could be charging them higher rates for that in order to discourage that type of water use. If you have increasing block rates, consider, though, how many of your customers are large families, because large families will likely be using large volumes of water consistently over time. And the point of increasing block rates is not to punish those types of customers for their baseline needs, for their basic water demands. So if you have a community where most of your customers are large families, reconsider having increasing block rates, or at least where the block starts. I'm not going to talk very much about the other types of rate structures in too much detail. I'm just going to kind of go through them relatively quickly. There are some other creative designs out there. And the ones I've just described are the most common ones so far. But there are targeted block rate structures where you have a rate structure that looks like an increasing and decreasing block rate at the same time. So it might start off as an increasing block rate up through a residential consumption amount, and then the rates will decrease beyond that in order to give the large non-residential customers a lower price rate. So it's combining both the increasing and decreasing price signals that we just talked about. Uniform at one block rate is a very, very uncommon one, and it looks like an increasing block rate structure, but the difference is, instead of charging a customer, if a customer uses 7,000 gallons in this example, instead of charging the first 4,000 at this low rate and then the next 3,000 at that higher rate, at 7,000 you would charge the customer $4 per thousand, the high rate, for the entire 7,000 gallon consumption. So it provides a much stronger price signal, much stronger price signal for customers to conserve than an increasing block rate structure. This is a very uncommon example, though. It is a very good one if you are trying to encourage conservation. I won't talk about the next one because that one's specifically for residential sewer, not for water. But uniform rates with a cap means you don't charge rates above a specific amount. If you have questions about that, please post a question. But this is it's a sewer-only rate structure. Budget-based rates is something that's catching on a little bit, not so much for small systems, usually for larger ones. And the M1 manual actually has a whole chapter on budget-based rates. The idea is the same thing as an increasing block rate, but what you would do is you would have for every single individual customer, you would set up the block sizes based on that customer's based on that customer's historic demand. The last one I wanted to mention is not having a volumetric rate structure at all. So we know from the previous poll that nobody here does that, where you just charge a flat charge and there's no volumetric charge. So I won't talk about that in much detail, but there are utilities that don't have a rate structure that is dependent on water demand. So with that, I'm going to ask a quick poll question, and that one is, what is the type of rate structure that you have, the volumetric rate structures that you currently have? And the flat charge one is non-volumetric, so we know that nobody should be picking that. Uniform rate is the one that some utilities call flat rates as well. All right, thank you. Most of you are uniform rate. Actually, almost everybody's uniform or increasing block, and it's evenly split. And there was, okay, I apologize. I thought that there was nobody here was non-volumetric, but it looks like there may have been a couple of you. And then there's some other ones. For those of you that said other, if you can please type in the question box just to give us some idea of what kind of rate structures you currently have. That would be helpful. Thank you. If you do have block rate structures, whether it's increasing, decreasing, or targeted or uniform, there are some things to consider when you're designing your rate structure. One of them is to decide on the correct number of blocks. And that one is relatively complicated. I mean, you can start off with 2 blocks, and it can go up to whatever you want. We've seen rate structures that have 10 different blocks for residential customers, which I think might be a little bit excessive. Most of the time you see 3 to 5 blocks, where the first block would be either the lifeline demand or average demand. And the second block would either be average or kind of close to what the summertime demand would be before irrigation. And then the third block is kind of where you're targeting higher demands for residential customers, where there are probably going to be discretionary demands. So where you start and end the block is an important consideration. These are kind of what I just mentioned, starting off the block at the lifeline or at the average use. That's sort of what most of the consultants and the manuals recommend to do for residential. For the commercial and the non-residential customers, it's much more complicated because you'll find a lot of customers, a lot of non-residential customers who use low amounts of water, and a lot of customers who use high amounts of water, and it will be a little bit tricky to identify specific blocks where you're trying to target discretionary use, because it will be hard to decipher which one is discretionary or not. But for the residential side, aim for somewhere between 2 to 5 different blocks for the entire spectrum of residential demands. I think 3 or 4 is usually what most utilities do. If you have a rate structure that's based on block, make sure that the rates between blocks are substantial. The difference between the rates between blocks are substantial. We've seen some examples where the rate structure is, where the rates only go up by 50 cents per 1,000 gallons, or even sometimes just by 10 cents per 1,000 gallons between blocks. If you do that, it defeats the whole purpose of having a block rate structure in the first place. It just complicates your billing software and your billing calculations, and it provides no difference to you. You might as well just have a uniform rate. So make sure that the differential between blocks is large. There aren't very many recommendations and guidelines on what that difference should be. We've seen, and you don't have to quote me on this, but we've seen some suggestions that at least 25% higher between blocks, if you're doing an increasing block, would be enough to provide a price signal for customers that these blocks are significant in the rate structure design. It doesn't have to be 25%. The best thing to do is to do a cost of service study that will try to allocate the different prices and rates into the different blocks. You would start off by designing the block sizes first before trying to calculate what the rates should be between blocks. If you do this process and then you find out that the differentials are too small, then you might need to change the block size and then recompute what the rates should be. Another thing to keep in mind is that meter reading has to be punctual if you have a block rate structure. If you read meters too early or too late, you might be putting customers into lower or higher blocks unfairly. So they might be, if you read a meter too late, then that last few days or extra few days of consumption might push them off into the second block. But if you had read the meter on time every single month, then they would have only been paying that first block in both months as well. So the meter reading has to be much more punctual if you have a block rate structure. Of course, you have to be punctual with uniform rates too. And then replacing meters frequently and repairing lines quickly, because the older the water meters, the less water use is being registered. And if you have an increasing block rate structure, that means lower revenues for you, because you'll be missing consumption that does happen in the second block that you're not actually registering in your meters and you're not charging for accurately. And I mentioned before they have to consider the adverse effects on large families. There's more text in here that repeats basically what I said earlier. The temporal adjustments, again, were just looking at drought surcharges and having a different rate structure based on the water shortage response plan. So if you've entered stage 1 or stage 2 of your water shortage response plan, then you can charge higher rates during that temporary period. But then when you drop back to a normal period, those excess surcharges will disappear and customers go back to normal rates. The key for this, though, I'm not spending too much time on this, but the key for this is to have these rate structures designed in advance and communicated with the customers in advance of any droughts that might occur. So that way they know that this is done not retroactively as a way for utilities to just make more money during a drought, but that you're planning ahead of time in case this happens, in case of an emergency. Frequency of rate changes. It's always recommended to review your rates at least annually. Your rate structure design every couple of years, 2 to 3 years, maybe 4 years. Don't go too long without reviewing your rate structure design itself. And if you have a hard time with your reviewing your rates and encouraging your council or boards to approve rate increases year after year, please feel free to contact us. We have some ideas of how to communicate with them and to get some buy-in from the utility. That's a different presentation from this. I won't be talking too much about it. There are ways to tie your rate structure to cost indexes and to have automatic rate increases based on specific cost indices. There are a lot of pros and cons on that as well. So if you do have one of those rate structures, we can talk about them. One of the cons is that those price indices don't really match very well with your utility costs, especially if you're looking at future costs and how your capital needs factor into your future costs as well. But that is one way that some utilities get some buy-in in reviewing and asking for rate increases. It's important to avoid maintaining low rates at the expense of utilities' financial health. We have done some analyses and we've seen that utilities that don't raise rates for 5, 6, 7 years at a time or 10 years at a time, on average have much, much higher rate increases when they do raise their rates, and they have 50% to sometimes 100% rate increases. And that is what really hurts the customers as opposed to having small rate increases over time as well. So make sure that you're not, if you have affordability as a really important objective, it doesn't affect your cost recovery needs and not have enough to pay for all of your costs. We have some PDFs of rate structure examples, and I'm just going to pull up what it looks like. I won't go over them, but this will be posted on the website as well. And we're showing some just different examples, all from small systems, of what the rate structures look like. When we do these rate surveys and we get the rate structures, we get all sorts of documents and different ways of presenting rates. The simpler the presentation, the easier it is to communicate with customers. But you'll see in these examples there are some utilities that charge based on meter size, like this one. There are some that just charge a flat charge, like this one that was just faxed to us as well. But this is going to be a resource available in case you want to see how to present rates as well. So we're going to do, maybe I'm going to look at 2 different scenarios we'll have 2 different scenarios of utilities and different customer bases and talk about how those affect the rate structure design. Keep in mind when we're presenting these, and then the slides, we have more scenarios in here. I'll present 2, but there are more slides in here that talk about all of them. Keep in mind that one rate structure does not fit all, even within each of these scenarios. So even in the scenario, you might have 2 utilities that have the same scenario, but something else is different about them that what we're recommending here doesn't really apply to them. So what we're showing is what's a good starting point when you're designing a rate structure. And then after that, you could take that starting point and then adjust according to other conditions that apply to your utility. So just to know which ones to present, I'm going to launch a poll that asks, which of these 5 scenarios would you like me to present on? And I'll only present on 2, but you can select as many as you want. Groundwater system, so non-purchase, with a small customer base. Purchase system, so they have a lot more on the variable charges side. If you're worried about affordability, so how can you design a rate structure to address affordability? Water demand is either too high or it's decreasing over time, so there's changes to the water demand. Or the customer base is seasonal. If you are a seasonal community, that might be one that you want to see. So we'll give you a couple more, let's say 5 more seconds to choose the ones that you want. Okay, I think we're good. Thank you. Well, that makes my job a lot easier. So it's a clear choice between these two. So we'll start off with the groundwater system with the small customer base, and those of you who may be worried about affordability. And those are, if I had to guess, I would have guessed those two choices. For those of you who I won't be presenting on other presentations, other scenarios, the slides will be available online, and I'm always available to discuss with you one-on-one on your specific utilities needs and designing a rate structure for that case. For a groundwater system with a very small customer base, we're talking about high fixed costs and a very small number of customers. Let's say you've got 500 customers. What I would recommend starting off with is considering having high base charges because you've got these high costs that you have to allocate to a small number of customers. Start off assuming that you have to have these high base charges. If the base charges are so high, when you do the cost calculations and you price out the rates and the costs are too high, you might want to consider including a consumption allowance. And that could be 1,000 or 2,000 gallons for residential customers. The allowances could be different for different meter sizes as well, if you have meter-based charges. Consider having a monthly billing cycle if you don't already do that, if you have a very small number of customers. But if you have a moderate number of customers where you can make the cost calculation and the argument that by reading the meters less frequently than monthly, so every 2 months, there's a more substantial cost savings on that side than by having the revenue stability coming in from monthly rates. Then bi-monthly rate structures might be more, bi-monthly billing periods might be more applicable to you than monthly billing. These are really, so the key thing for this kind of scenario is really the base charge versus the volumetric charge. And what you do with the base charge will then automatically affect the volumetric. High base charge, I think, is where you want to start off with this one, and then worry about the volumetric next. As far as what kind of volumetric rate structure, whether it's uniform or increasing block, that depends on other criteria. So whether or not you have a water shortage issue, or you're trying to encourage conservation, or if you just want to have just simple rates or fair rates. If you're a very small utility and you want to simplify your billing structure, then you would have a uniform rate structure. But if you are encouraging conservation in order to reduce your costs on the variable costs, which is not a big portion here, then you might want to consider increasing block for residential customers. The other example was affordability of rates. And I'm assuming that everybody here was talking about affordability for residential customers specifically, not for non-residential. The first thing I mentioned is don't compromise your revenue sufficiency to maintain artificially low rates. We've seen those examples, and in the end, it affects public health because utility is not able to invest in the system, and we'll find more health-based violations and water quality issues, and they won't be able to afford capital costs for replacing their assets in the future. So don't have artificially low rates. That's not the way to solve this issue. The way to solve it might be to start off with a separate rate structure for your residential customers. So separate out your residential from your non-residential customers. Have a rate structure for your residential customers that starts off with a low base charge with no consumption allowance. So that way the customers start off with a low bill, especially if you have a lot of low income and low fixed income customers. And then have an increasing block rate structure where the first block might be a lifeline consumption. So that the bare minimum that customers need to live on, to bathe, to cook, to wash, to drink. And that is usually close to about 2,000 gallons a month. It's not that much of a high demand. So start off with a first block that ends at about 2,000 gallons, and then have steep rate increases beyond that, because you have to be recovering your costs and if you're having these low rates of the low consumption amounts, you have to spread those revenue requirements onto the higher users. So you have steep rate increases between blocks after that. And then charge monthly billing, because bi-monthly means, or other kinds of billing frequencies mean higher bills for the customers, and it becomes a more difficult bill to pay for. So monthly billing is easier for customers. There are other ways to adjust to assist customers with affordability. You could have a customer assistance program that provides financial support for customers who can't pay, who are documented low-income or fixed-income customers who can't pay their bills. So you can target those needs specifically for the customers who have real affordability issues. We have a whole different presentation on that topic alone. We have some examples and some resources available for you. So if you've got questions about customer assistance programs, feel free to contact us. And then find out if it's legal in your state to charge different rates for low-income or fixed-income customers. We've seen some examples in some states, not very many, but in some states that allow utilities to have a rate structure for senior citizens, for example, and that will be a completely different customer classification. But I would check the legality of that issue before trying it in your state. So at the end of doing a rate structure, by designing your rate structure, the next two steps is to compute what the rates are, which I mentioned earlier I wasn't going to talk about, and you do that through a cost of service study, and I'll show you again the resources that are available to you to help you with that, and to reevaluate and adjust the rate structure after you've priced it out to make sure that your proposed rate structure now does everything you want it to do. It meets all of the objectives that you ranked from 1 to 4 or more in the previous step. To compute the costs, like I said, you do a cost of service study, and the resources that are available are the M1 manual and the AWA manuals, as well as the EPA Guidebook, which I will show you a link to again in a minute. And to reevaluate the proposed rate structure, we provide a list of a checklist of 6 questions that you should ask yourself after you've designed a rate structure and propose a new rate structure to make sure that that rate structure now meets all of the objectives that you've set out to do. And I apologize, won't have enough time to cover each of these individually. The rate setting resources, again, these are the 2 websites, and you'll have the PowerPoint slides sent to you. Another resource I wanted to point out real quick is we have an Excel tool that is basically a cash flow model that any water system can use. We've developed it specifically for small water systems. You can download this for free on our website or the EFC and EFC Network website. It's a tool that allows you, that just walks you through putting in some data inputs. The data inputs are very minimal. You just need to put in what the current rate structured rates are and the design is, what your proposed new rates will be, what your expected costs will be the next year, and what the water use levels have been in the past year. And just from that, the cash flow model shows you how your what your end of year balance will be in the next up to 20 years from now. So it can help you run different scenarios. You can change these numbers and watch your fund balance change over time, so you can make sure that you have enough revenue to pay for your expected expenses for up to 5 or 6 years or so. So this is a tool that's available online. You're welcome to download it, use it, and if you have questions, you can always contact us, and we can help you modify it and make sure that you're answering all the questions that you've got. Francine, do you see any questions online that we have not yet answered?
No, I don't see any questions.
All right. We will, if you do have questions, please feel free to contact us on our website. And if you did send us a question that we might have missed, we apologize, and we'll get back to you directly by email. There are 2 resources. EFCnetwork.org has a lot of these guidebooks that we talked about. This presentation will be on there. The webinar will be recorded and posted on there. We also have a blog that talks about water issues, water system management, and finances that you're welcome to subscribe to as well. And what we will do next is ask you one last poll question, which is whether or not you would like us to help you with any of these issues. So do you want us to contact you? Do you have questions on rate setting and rate structure design that you would like us to talk to you one-on-one? Choose the first option. If you'd like us to subscribe you to the EFC blog, feel free to check that. If you want to use the spreadsheet tool that I mentioned and then would like us to follow up with you afterwards, please choose the third option. You can choose as many options as you like. And we'll give you a couple. I thank you all for staying with us. I apologize for going 5 minutes over, but appreciate all of your patience.
Thank you, Shadi, and thank you everyone for participating in our webinar.